Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Barbara Zubank. It's great to see people from all over Europe, to see them very enthusiastically attending this conference. And I want to congratulate the Austrian colleagues from the Center for Public Administration Research with this successful event. I think it's important, especially in these barren times with COVID and all the challenges of our societies, to have a positive project which emphasizes the professionality of the public sector. And I think we all know that the state is back. I think it will be there for a long time. I also think there will be no such a thing as a post-COVID period. We will have to live with a lot of crises, and I think ultimately people realize that the public sector, government, its administration, the state, they do make a difference, and they are part of the solution. So I'm very happy to also, the second reason I'm very happy to be on board of here is that from the very beginning of CAF, it's almost like closing the circle. It was also an Austrian initiative initially during the presidency, a previous presidency of Austria, to launch this initiative, this CAF initiative. And then for Portugal, as the successor presidency of the European Union, to have this major conference in Lisbon, which I was very privileged to attend, and not just to attend, but to give the keynote, with 1,500 people attending there and launching the CAF initiative. And I think it's almost like a big cycle where we are at the edge of a new cycle. I hope this will be the case. So my speech is about the future of CAF, for the future of public governance. And you will notice from the starting screen of my PowerPoint that I actually talk about CAF 2020 plus, because obviously when it would be CAF 2020, it would all be history. So we have to look at the future. And so it's a plus, not just for the positive sign of CAF, but also to look into the future. Future is our identity. If we don't look in the future, it's also about not being, we should be convinced that copy-pasting the past will not be part of the solution. And so we will have to look at the future, to look at new solutions for our societies. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So I will cover 5 points. First of all, no, the previous one. I just will actually, can I get the previous one? This is the third slide. Yes. So what I will talk about is actually about quality and governance. And so there have been several approaches historically with models and competing models, with checklists and competing checklists. Then I will say something about CAF as a leverage instrument, but also to make sure that we are aware that we live in changing times. I don't have to convince you of that issue. And that's why we need CAF Revisited, CAF 2020 plus. And then I will actually give some conclusions. Next slide, please. So it's on the models and the checklists for quality and governance, which we have had in the past. Yes. So I think most of these things are familiar to you, but I think it's good to give a kind of short crash course of how models and checklists have been used to ensure quality of management and quality of governance. And so you're familiar with most of the names, I suppose. ISO is the oldest system and is still on board here and has been renovating and reinventing itself with ISO 9000. And you see a kind of expansion of the quality models according to the needs in society and for governance. Balanced scorecard is obviously also very well known, 4 dimensions in the model. It's a very American one. It's very private sector oriented. It was invented for the private sector, even if then it also tried to cover the public sector market, because it's about a history of competition between models too. EFQM, as you also know, is the kind of counterpart against the not against the Americans, but to have the European version of quality models from the foundation in Brussels. And of course, it's 9 dimensions. Balanced scorecard is 4 dimensions. EFQM is 9 dimensions. Actually, it's 9 plus 1, because I will show you historically the second, the second version of EFQM, then integrated also, and actually stole a bit from Balanced Scorecard, its 4th dimension of innovation and learning, the feedback loop in the model. So Balanced Scorecard was very upset about that, those that owned that. So you see actually this competition between the models, and also the converging strategies in expanding and rewriting the models then. CAF, of course, is, the history here is very clear too. It was a competition, it's a clearly kind of European product of compromise, because, on the one hand, the French said, we don't want to be compared with other European countries, and the Germans had the Speyer Qualitätswettbewerb, the competition from Speyer, where they said, well, we also have a system there, well, especially after the unification in Germany, to say it's not about an Olympic game, where we have to find the best. It's about who makes the biggest progress. And that's actually very important in the public sector. It's about progress, not just about the gold medal here. And of course, the Speyer Wettbewerb, then it was for the whole Germanic speaking community in Europe, which is the biggest language community in Europe. And the British said, we have EFQM, so we won't change that. And so the compromise was actually a CAF model, which was not competitive and which took into account improvement. It was mentioned by the chair. One of my favorite models is also MAF. Maybe it's not so well known, the Management Accountability Framework, which is a Canadian model, and I invite you still to go there. I think it's a very inspiring one. So we see a history of convergence, we see a history of competition, we see a discussion, because it's about market share, because it's about consultancy, it's about selling models too, not CAF, of course, which is a public good, luckily, but there is a kind of competition there to try to cover or pretend to cover, to squeeze the public sector into these private models. That's the first one. The second thing is checklists. We have also a whole range of checklists for good governance. And I put it between brackets there, inverted commas, good. Good for whom? When it rains, it's bad for tourism, but it's good for agriculture. And so we have to be very careful with good. Good for whom? It's a cultural issue too, especially in a global context. And the chair mentioned my presence at CEPA, which is a global way of thinking. A global way of thinking. We have to take culture, it does matter, we have to take culture into account, and good is opposed to bad, right? Still, and so we have to be worried about that word. So so there is a corporate governance literature on these checklists, private sector corporate governance. OECD has its list. EU has its list for the the countries that are joining the union and to prepare for the acquis. There was reference to CEPA. Of course, now I'm an ambassador and a champion of the Sustainable Development Goals driven principles for effective governance. And we should be aware that there is a huge tension here, ultimately, between checklists for organizations, which are actually corporate governance philosophies, and checklists for policy. Because policy is, of course, not the same as an organization. It's the difference between audit and evaluation, ultimately. We can come back to that later if we want. Next slide, please. And so then we move to CAF. Yes, as a leverage, CAF has been a leverage. There is no doubt about that. And I think the first conference I referred to, was cross-country. Well, the cross refers to skiing too. It's not cross-country skiing, which is now forbidden for COVID, except for Austrians, of course, who can do the cross-country ski. But it was a cross-country event. It was cross-policy. It was cross levels of government. So that's a quite unique setting. And in the successions after the Lisbon conference, we have had the conferences in Den Haag, in Copenhagen, and Helsinki. So there was also this national cascading, so to have the kind of looking at the national approaches of CAF and then send the good practices to the European scenery. But always from the perspective, even if EFQM has these scoring systems with the marks, always from the perspective of bench learning. What can we learn from one another? And I think it's crucial in the public sector context to have this peer learning. The peer platforms are actually give the legitimacy to say we are not aiming for gold medals here. We are aiming to improve services for our citizens. And so that became from a radar perspective to an awareness of our strengths and weaknesses. And that shifted to a critical assessment of looking into the mirror to say, how can we continue to be part of a solution? And the map to look at this reality, to look in the mirror, was CAF, is CAF still in a way. And so this improvement strategy was an important focus. But it was also beyond Europe. I think some of you know the translations of the CAF model into Turkish and even into Chinese. And I've been privileged also to attend, certainly in China, some of the exposure of CAF as an export model. So that could become a kind of neo-colonial way of imperialism to import our governance models, but I think that's probably not politically correct to say that. But still, it's a kind of intellectual strategy to say, especially in a global debate on what is governance, and I think the connection also with governance and democracy becomes important here, because we increasingly have this debate to say, yes, we can have governance even without democracy. That's not our framework. Next slide, please. And so we have to be aware that this cycle of 20 years of CAF, that this cannot be copy-pasted for the future, because there are crucial changes in the political realities and in the matching public governance realities. And actually what we see that for the future, we have to combine three moving targets. I always say it's a bit like clay shooting. Clay shooting, it's an Olympic discipline. You have the shooter, you have the cannon, you have the clay, and then you try to hit the clay. Well, the game we're in is that it's clay shooting, but everything is moving at the same time. Not just the clay, also the cannon, also the hunter, and the turbulence. Everything is moving at the same time. And so as a public sector, as a state, as a government, all levels of government, we have to ensure the service delivery, routine service delivery. And I think it's a crucial thing, it's a difficult thing, because, with COVID, we noticed we're not, some of you are at home now, I can see it, or you have flashy home-like offices, but I think it's very clear, some of you are at home. I think it's very clear to say some of us can work at home, but some people cannot work just at home because they have to collect their garbage, and they have to ensure security, and they have to teach, and they have to be in the hospital. You can't run this from home. And so we see this is a very huge tension. The second thing is digital, of course. Digital services have to be ensured, and that creates a kind of virtual space for routine delivery. We see a lot of partnerships because the public sector is not able anymore just as public sector to deliver all the routine services. So we need partnerships for public service. That has to be combined with solving and coping, perhaps not solving, but coping with crisis, plural. And not just expected crisis. We have a lot of unexpected crisis. And as I said, this will be chronicle. We will have to organize a combination of delivering, ensuring routine services with coping with chronicle crisis governance. Unexpected, so slowly, incrementally increasing, like climate change. Suddenly, of course, we will have too hot or too cold or too much water or too dry, but also sudden ones like this pandemic now. And that has to be combined with reinventing and innovating possible futures of our public sector and how the public sector is embedded in society and how we organize public governance in this complex society. And that requires changing legal frameworks. That implies also that we will have to have experiments and we have to allow for pilot studies and experiments. Although we should not experiment in society, we still have to organize controlled experiments. And that means changing decision-making. We have Twitter decision-making, so more digital, communicated. We have participatory decision-making, where people are involved. And all of that is actually affecting the whole policy cycle. And the changing contents of policies are there too. The biggest worry for the future is exclusion. We will have to ensure inclusion. People feel excluded. It could be urban areas, it could be minorities, it could be ethnic or cultural or religious minorities. It could be digital divide issues, but we have a general feeling of uneasiness in our societies, and that affects the trust levels of exclusion. I think inclusion will have to become a crucial word as part of our policies to make sure we have consolidated, legitimate policies. And that affects our structures, not just hierarchies, not just the public sector as a hierarchy, but we have to amend it and add market mechanisms and network mechanisms in a functional way. And that means we have to combine not just logics of consequences. Logics of consequences is about results. Yes, we want effectiveness. We want people to be satisfied. We want people to rely and trust on our services. That's about results. We have to have tangible results, and we have to make that visible. It's not just about being convinced ourselves. You know, it's like justice. Justice needs to be delivered, but it needs to be seen to be delivered. Well, it's the same with our services. They have to be seen to be delivered in an effective way. And we have to combine this with appropriateness. Appropriateness at the individual level, corruption. At the organizational level, transparency, responsibility, accountability, cultures of being citizen-focused, and appropriateness of our policies, which is about inclusion. Inclusion, inclusion, inclusion. Next slide, please. And that means it should affect our CAF model. We have to redesign CAF2020 plus. That means we have to move in our focus from functioning organizations to effective policies. CAF2020 plus should be about effective policies. We have to move from just logics of consequences, results, performance, the results side of CAF, to logics of consequences plus logics of appropriateness, the values, the cultures, individual organization policies. We have to move from enablers. Enablers is much too weak as a concept. That's not convincing at all. We have to move to capacity, and it has to be flexible capacity. If we want to deliver services and simultaneously contain crisis and simultaneously innovate. We have to be able to move people, competences, finances, responsibilities, and that's capacity. Capacity, and it should be seen that it is part of the solution. The fourth point is effective governance equals effectiveness, accountability, and inclusion. And we're here referring to the CEPA 11 principles. And I invite you to go to the website and to download the listing. So it's clustered around effectiveness, accountability, and inclusion. The fifth point is risk. Yes, we have audit and risk for audits and so on. We are, in the meantime, we are familiar with that, and it's included in our audit systems. But now we will have to move from risk to risk plus uncertainty. Uncertainty is a totally different game, because we can calculate risk, we can take risks, but uncertainty is a totally different game. We cannot necessarily put numbers there. And so uncertainty, to cope with uncertainties, is something we have to import in our systems. And finally, and last but certainly not least, we have to focus on the ultimate objectives. It's trust and legitimacy. Trust and legitimacy. And I think that's the ultimate purpose. It's about trust of society in the public sector. It's about trust of the public sector in society. It's about trust within the public sector. It's about trust between politics and administration. And all of that together, if we want to keep the legitimacy of our systems, we have to focus on that. Next slide, please. And that implies that CAF 2020 plus, yes, needs to be adjusted. I think it is necessary to work on a model to mobilize for effective government and governance in Europe at all levels, especially in times of crisis. And I think linking CAF 2020 plus to future models of public governance with the European flavor is crucial, possible, urgent, and especially with the Green Deal at the European level, which we share. And I think this conference is certainly part of that solution. Thank you very much. Over to you, Chair.